June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. Dawn arrived like a wound being torn open. The sea was still violent when the first waves reached the beaches, churning gray water into foam streaked with oil and blood. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and burning metal. Landing craft lay ripped apart along the shoreline, their ramps frozen in place like broken jaws. Helmets, rifles, and packs floated where men had disappeared beneath the surf. By mid-morning, the beach had already taken more lives than anyone could count. By nightfall, the invasion had succeeded. The beaches were in Allied hands. Flags rose where machine guns had once ruled. Commanders marked maps with confident lines pushing inland. In England, men exhaled for the first time in years. The impossible had been done. Fortress Europe had been breached. And then, almost immediately, something began to feel wrong. The sound of the battle started to fade far too quickly. The expected roar of a breakout never came. Instead of a rolling thunder moving inland, there was a strange quiet. Not the calm of victory, but the uneasy stillness that follows a shock when no one knows what comes next. The great invasion force that was supposed to surge across France slowed as soon as it left the sand. Movement became cautious. Orders became careful. The war, which should have accelerated, hesitated. Normandy swallowed momentum. The hedgerows were nothing like the planners imagined. Thick walls of earth, packed hard by centuries of rain and roots, rose chest-high and higher. Tangled vegetation crowned them, turning every field into a hidden fortress. Tanks could not see over them. Infantry could not cross them without exposing themselves. Every gap was pre-sighted. Every lane was a killing zone. Radios failed. Maps lied. 100 yards could cost a dozen lives. Days passed. Then more days. Men who had survived the landing now crouched in shallow foxholes, listening to insects buzz and distant engines idle. Nights were long and wet. Mornings came with fog that hid friend and enemy alike. The war felt smaller here, tighter, as if the vast machinery of Allied power had been squeezed into a maze it could not escape. The beaches, so loud just days earlier, grew quiet. That silence frightened the men who understood war best. If stories like this matter to you, stories that live in the space between victory and disaster, take a moment to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from anywhere in the world. These moments only survive if they're remembered. Behind the lines, staff officers stared at maps that no longer behaved the way maps were supposed to. Arrows meant to race inland remained frozen in place. Villages marked as secured continued to send back casualty reports. Units expected to break through instead dug in. What had looked decisive on paper became slow, grinding attrition on the ground. At the center of it all stood Bernard Montgomery, architect of the Allied ground plan in Normandy. To the public, he radiated calm certainty. He spoke of control, of deliberate pressure, of keeping the enemy pinned while strength accumulated. His philosophy was simple and proven. Avoid reckless speed. Prevent overextension. Win by discipline. That approach had worked before. But Normandy was not open desert. It was not wide maneuver space where armor could breathe and lines could flex. Here, caution came at a cost measured in blood and time. Every pause gave the enemy a chance to adapt. Every delayed push allowed German units to re-anchor themselves deeper into the terrain. The cost did not explode. It crept. Medics counted morphine syringes and wondered how long supplies would last. Platoons entered villages at full strength and emerged thinner, quieter. Tanks moved carefully and still found mines placed exactly where caution forced them to go. Casualties mounted not in dramatic surges, but in a steady, exhausting drip. The enemy noticed. Intelligence intercepts began to tell an unsettling story. German commanders were not panicking. They were not preparing for a sudden collapse. Their language was changing. They spoke of endurance, of holding, of forcing the invaders to bleed slowly in the hedgerows until something gave way. The Allies had expected fear. Instead, they found calculation. This was the first twist. though almost no one recognized it as such at the time. The Germans no longer feared a rapid breakout. They feared exhaustion. They were building their defense around the assumption that the Allies would move carefully, predictably, and slowly. Normandy, intended as a springboard, was becoming a vice. On the ground, the men sensed it before headquarters admitted it. Orders grew more conservative. Objectives shrank. Recon patrols returned with the same grim reports. The war felt stuck not because the enemy was unbeatable, but because no one wanted to be the one who gambled and lost everything already paid for in blood. There was another reason for the hesitation, unspoken but heavy. The invasion had worked. That alone made risk terrifying. No commander wanted to be remembered as the man who turned success into catastrophe. The beachhead was fragile. Supplies flowed through narrow corridors. A failed push could expose flanks, invite counterattacks, and fracture the delicate balance holding the invasion together. Caution felt responsible. It felt safe. But safety was becoming its own danger. Somewhere beyond the front, far from the hedgerows and the mud, a different kind of tension simmered. George Patton was not in Normandy. He had been kept away deliberately. Officially, he was part of a deception. Unofficially, he was considered too volatile for the most complex operation of the war. His instinct was speed. His nature was movement. And movement, many believed, was exactly what could shatter the beachhead if it went wrong. Yet as the days dragged on, his absence began to feel less like protection and more like restraint. Behind closed doors, quiet conversations started to change tone. The question surfaced not as an accusation, but as a doubt. What if the invasion was not slowing because the Allies were being careful, but because they were being predictable? What if the enemy was no longer reacting to Allied pressure, but waiting for it? No one dared ask that question publicly. To do so would mean admitting that D-Day, barely completed, might already be drifting toward something dangerous. Politically, strategically, psychologically, that admission was unacceptable. So the beaches stayed quiet, not because the fighting was over, but because both sides were watching the clock. In the hedgerows, German machine gun crews adjusted angles learned through blood. Artillery batteries recalculated ranges with cold precision. Every Allied probe was met not with desperation, but with patience. The enemy had stopped trying to push the invaders back into the sea. He was content to let them stay, bleed, and slow themselves to death. The men at the front did not know whose vision would prevail. They only knew that the war they had been promised after June 6th had not arrived. The sweeping advance briefed in England had dissolved into mud, roots, and narrow lanes where death came without warning and without drama. History would later call D-Day inevitable. It would speak of momentum and destiny. But in those early days, inevitability felt like a lie. Maps were redrawn. Timetables were erased. Confidence was replaced with calculation. And far from the beaches, a general built for speed waited while the war refused to move. The silence after the landings was not peace. It was the sound of a gamble tightening its grip. The silence did not mean the war had slowed. It meant the war had changed shape. By the second week after the landings, Normandy had become a contest of patience rather than power. The Allied armies were enormous on paper, but on the ground they were compressed into narrow corridors of mud, roots, and smoke. Every advance required planning measured in hours for movement measured in yards. Every yard was paid for with blood. What worried the commanders most was not the casualties. Wars consumed men. That was expected. What worried them was the pattern. German resistance was no longer reactive. It was anticipatory. Units thought to be shattered reappeared intact in new positions. Artillery that should have been destroyed found fresh firing angles. Counterattacks came not in panic, but in precise, localized thrusts designed to test, delay, and withdraw. The enemy was not trying to throw the invaders back into the sea. He was trying to keep them exactly where they were. The hedgerows were doing the rest. Each field became a separate battle. Tanks nosed forward only to be struck at close range. Infantry crawled through gaps barely wide enough for a man, knowing the first soldier through would draw fire. Time stretched. Men aged weeks and days. Confidence drained quietly, replaced by exhaustion. Behind the front, the weight of responsibility began to settle on Allied leadership. Bernard Montgomery continued to project confidence. His public statements emphasized control, coordination, and pressure. He believed the German army was being fixed in place, that every day of attrition weakened their ability to respond elsewhere. In his view, patience was not hesitation. It was discipline. But discipline had a cost that could not be ignored forever. American commanders, watching their units grind forward inch by inch, began to feel that cost personally. Reports arrived describing battalions chewed down in terrain that offered no decisive advantage. The question was no longer whether the enemy could be beaten. It was how long it would take and what would be lost along the way. Then came the intelligence summaries that shifted the tone of every briefing. Intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations revealed a troubling truth. German commanders no longer spoke of breaking the invasion. They spoke of surviving it, of forcing the Allies into a slow war where numerical advantage mattered less than endurance. Their reserves were being repositioned not for dramatic counterattacks, but for containment. This was the second layer of the first twist. The Germans had accepted that the beaches were lost. What they had not accepted was defeat. Normandy was becoming a test of will, and the clock was ticking against the invaders. If you're still here walking through this moment with us, consider subscribing to WW2 Frontline Legends. Stories like this are built for those who want to understand how close history came to turning the other way. And tell us where you're watching from around the world. As the days passed, the danger grew less visible but more severe. Supply lines stretched through narrow roads vulnerable to air attack and artillery. Fuel and ammunition piled up faster than they could be moved forward. The longer the front stalled, the more fragile the balance became. What had begun as caution now risked becoming paralysis. Within Allied headquarters, conversations shifted from confidence to concern. The planners had assumed momentum would follow the landings automatically. They had not fully accounted for terrain that punished movement or an enemy willing to trade ground for time. Every plan depended on a breakout that had not yet come. And the longer it didn't, the more dangerous the situation became. There was a growing fear no one wanted to articulate openly. If the Germans could hold long enough, if they could stabilize the front and bleed the Allied armies slowly, political pressure might begin to build. Public confidence could erode. Resources might be diverted. The invasion that had shocked the world could settle into a costly stalemate. Another Verdun. It was at this point that the moral dilemma sharpened. Push harder, faster, and risk exposing the fragile beachhead to counterattack. Or continue the slow grind and risk letting the enemy dictate the pace of the war. Both choices carried the possibility of disaster. Both would be remembered by history as either brilliance or folly. Some officers began to wonder whether caution had crossed an invisible line. The enemy, after all, was adapting faster than expected. German units had begun modifying their defenses, reinforcing hedgerows, positioning anti-tank weapons at closer ranges, and exploiting every pause in Allied movement. They were no longer reacting to pressure. They were predicting it. Time itself had become the unseen enemy. Each day, without a breakout, gave the Germans another day to learn, another day to fortify, another day to bleed the invaders in terrain designed to erase advantages. And somewhere beyond the hedgerows, the absence of one man began to feel increasingly conspicuous. George Patton remained officially sidelined. His role in deception operations was still considered vital. German intelligence continued to believe he commanded a phantom army poised to strike elsewhere. That deception was working, but its success carried an unintended consequence. Patton was not where the war needed movement most. His reputation loomed large in conversations that never reached official minutes. Some saw him as reckless. Others saw him as exactly what the situation demanded, A general who believed speed itself was a weapon. A commander willing to accept chaos as the price of momentum. For now, those conversations remained quiet. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Then came the realization that forced the issue. German commanders were shifting forces south, not to attack, but to contain an anticipated American breakout that never came. They were planning for the Allies to move cautiously. They were planning for Montgomery's rhythm. That realization struck like cold water. The enemy was not guessing. He was reading the pattern. If the Allies continued as they were, the Germans would be ready for every move. The war would not break open. It would grind forward until something cracked under the weight. This was the moment the gamble began to take shape. Behind closed doors, a different kind of plan started to circulate. One that did not rely on gradual pressure or predictable advances. A plan that embraced shock, speed, and violence as tools to shatter the enemy's expectations. It was risky, extremely risky. The idea was simple and terrifying. Concentrate overwhelming force on a narrow front. Break through at all costs. Accept casualties. Accept confusion. Once through, move so fast that the enemy could not reorganize. This was not Montgomery's instinct. It was Patton's. The plan would later be known as Operation Cobra, but at this stage it existed only as a dangerous concept passed between officers who understood what failure would mean. A miscalculation could expose flanks, fracture coordination, and invite a devastating counterattack. The beachhead could collapse inward under the weight of its own ambition. Yet doing nothing was no longer an option. If the war stayed here, stalled in the hedgerows, the invasion risked losing the very momentum that had made it possible. Victory was not slipping away dramatically. It was being strangled quietly. If this tension resonates with you, if these turning points matter, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and stay with us as the story unfolds. Let us know where you're watching from. History is global, and so are its consequences. Montgomery approved the concept publicly, but doubts lingered behind the scenes. Some believed he underestimated how close Normandy had come to strategic failure. Others believed he expected the Americans to falter, reinforcing his belief in caution. No document ever fully settled the question. What is certain is that the decision marked a turning point. The war in Normandy was about to change from a test of endurance to a test of nerve. The careful balance that had held the front together was about to be deliberately shattered. On the ground, the men sensed something coming. Orders shifted. Units repositioned. Bombers gathered in numbers not seen since the landings. The air itself seemed to tighten with anticipation. The quiet after the beaches was ending. And when it ended, it would do so violently. What no one could know yet was whether the coming storm would save the invasion or finally break it. The storm broke without warning. At first light, the sky over Normandy filled with aircraft, their engines stacking into a single, crushing roar that drowned out every other sound. The ground shook as if the earth itself had turned against what lived on it. Bombs fell in patterns, so dense they erased the landscape beneath them. Hedgerows vanished. Roads disappeared. German positions that had resisted for weeks were reduced to smoke, flame, and silence in minutes. This was no probing attack. This was a gamble. The breakout began with violence, so concentrated it bordered on desperation. Allied commanders had accepted the risk they had spent weeks avoiding. They were no longer trying to manage the battlefield. They were trying to tear it open. When the bombers lifted and the dust began to settle, the ground war surged forward. Infantry moved through ground that no longer resembled Normandy at all. Tanks followed paths carved by destruction, engines screaming as if freed from restraint. Units advanced not cautiously, but urgently, driven by orders that demanded movement above all else. This was the war Patton believed in. Speed was not a luxury. It was survival. If you've made it this far into the story, you're already standing at the edge of history's most dangerous turning points. If moments like this matter to you, consider subscribing to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from around the world. This is where wars are truly decided. German defenses did not crumble politely. They fractured. Some units fought on in isolation, unaware their flanks had vanished. Others pulled back in confusion, unable to re-establish contact with higher command. Communication collapsed. Orders arrived too late or not at all. What had been a carefully constructed web of resistance unraveled under the weight of shock and speed. And then came the movement that changed everything. American columns broke through the containment lines and kept going. They did not pause to consolidate. They did not wait for perfect coordination. They moved, day and night. Engines burned hot. Men slept in vehicles when they slept at all. Maps became suggestions rather than instructions. This was chaos. And it worked. German commanders had prepared for pressure. They had not prepared for collapse. Their reserves, positioned to respond to predictable advances, now found themselves bypassed, surrounded, or rendered irrelevant. Entire divisions were cut off from supply and command. What had taken weeks to hold together came apart in days. The front did not bend. It shattered. From the perspective of those on the ground, the transformation was unreal. Fields that had consumed lives by the dozen were suddenly behind them. Roads once locked down by fire, now filled with prisoners moving the other way. The war that had felt suffocating only days earlier now seemed to breathe again. Yet beneath the exhilaration, unease remained. Because this kind of momentum cuts both ways. A single mistake could still expose everything. Flanks stretched thin. Units outran their support. Fuel shortages loomed. The very speed that made the breakthrough possible also carried the risk of overextension. The gamble had not ended. It had simply changed form. Behind the lines, commanders watched reports pour in with a mixture of relief and dread. The numbers were staggering. Distance covered. Enemy units destroyed. Prisoners taken. But beneath every success lay unanswered questions. Had the invasion truly been saved? Or had it simply survived a disaster narrowly avoided? This is where the story refuses to settle. Supporters of Montgomery would later argue that the breakthrough was only possible because of the slow pressure that preceded it. That German forces had been fixed in place, worn down, and denied freedom of movement. That without that groundwork, speed would have achieved nothing. Supporters of Patton would argue the opposite. That caution had allowed the enemy to adapt. That only shock and velocity broke the stalemate. That the invasion stood closer to failure than anyone was willing to admit. And that restraint nearly cost everything. The documents never fully resolved the debate. What remains clear is this. Normandy balanced on a knife's edge far longer than the world was told. If you feel that tension now, if you sense how close history came to another outcome, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from. These stories belong to all of us, wherever we are. As the breakout accelerated, the scale of German collapse became undeniable. Units surrendered en masse. Equipment was abandoned. Commanders struggled to understand how a front that had held for weeks had dissolved so quickly. The answer lay not in numbers alone, but in tempo. The war had changed speed. Time, once the enemy of the Allies, now turned against the Germans. Every hour, without reorganization, deepened the disaster. Every mile advanced widened the gap between intent and reality. The containment strategy the Germans had relied on was rendered meaningless by motion they could not predict or stop. Yet even in victory, uncertainty lingered. Was this outcome inevitable once the gamble was made? Or had the Allies simply been fortunate that the enemy could not recover fast enough? History tends to favor outcomes over intentions, but the men who lived through it knew how fragile the moment had been. The beachhead had not been secure. It had been waiting for someone to accept the risk no one wanted. And that raises the question that still fuels debate. Did Patton save D-Day? Or did Montgomery's caution create the conditions that made salvation possible? The answer depends on where one chooses to stand. On whether speed or restraint is valued more highly when the margin for error is measured in lives and nations. There is another truth quieter and less comfortable. Wars are not won by perfect plans. They are won by decisions made when plans begin to fail. Normandy did not unfold according to expectation. It survived because leaders adapted, argued, and gambled under pressure few could endure. The silence after the beaches was not confidence. It was uncertainty, and uncertainty forced action. If this story challenges what you thought you knew, stay with WW2 Frontline Legends. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from around the world. History is not settled by textbooks alone. It lives in the questions we keep asking. In the weeks that followed, the Allied advance would sweep across France. Paris would fall. The narrative of inevitability would harden. D-Day would become legend, polished and simplified. But beneath that legend lies a truth less often told. For a time, the invasion stalled. For a time, the enemy adapted. For a time, victory was not assured. And when the gamble came, it could have gone the other way. The beaches fell quiet too soon. And in that silence, the fate of the war hung unresolved. If courage, risk, and the fragile line between disaster and triumph still matter to you, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from. Because history is not just what happened. It is how close it came to not happening at all.